do have the CEO of PWR Advisory, Ivana Osagie. You have 3 decades worth of experience under your belt, and I assume that gives you a front row seat to all that has happened when it comes to the evolution of corporate governance and the risk culture. You've seen that evolve firsthand. What key shifts have you monitored? And considering the pace of change, would you say leadership is changing at the same pace?
Yes, thank you for having me today. I mean, when I look back, yes, 3 decades sounds like a long time, but I mean, in some regard, it's not. But the world has changed profoundly in that time, and I think the world today is so very different from what it was when I first started my career. So I think leadership is changing. Yes, for instance, risk management has now moved from being about a checklist, and also looking backwards. It's now becoming a lot more dynamic. So boards have responsibility for risk management, and they are now being more dynamic in the way that they engage with managing those risks. We also see that boards are beginning to realize that it's important to adopt a multi-stakeholder lens. So it's not just about focusing on shareholder returns. It's not just about short-term results. But boards are realizing that long-term value creation is very important and indeed critical to the success and the continuity of the businesses. So we talk a lot more about sustainability, and boards are starting to engage with those thoughts. I think also being able to manage the investment that is required to build resilience in the business, balancing that against the short-term requirements or the short-term desires of shareholders is something that boards are getting better at managing as well. There's also been a change in leadership. So many years ago, there was a focus on that command and control style of leadership. And now we're seeing that leadership is becoming more collaborative, a lot more inclusive, because we're dealing with so much diversity of business ideas, diversity of business platform, business models, even the demographics are changing. And so there's more of an understanding that there is wisdom in the crowd, and that when you bring more people together, you're getting better at your decision making, and you're getting more useful perspectives. So I think that's also a big change that we're seeing happen. You could say perhaps that the pace of change is outpacing the pace of change in leadership. But I mean, I think that's just the nature of the world that we live in today. So I think the change is happening. It's happening faster, but it probably needs to happen a bit more. And I think also now that we have AI being used a lot more widely, we'll see that we're able to do a whole lot more, move a lot faster, particularly using digital tools. So yes.
I mean, it's a keeping up game. But we know that there's also a lot of volatility. Things, as you have said, are changing faster pace. And what would you say is needed to strengthen these systems, especially to recover from these constant recurring shocks?
That's such a great question. I think that let me start by talking about scenario planning. So we talked about risk earlier on, and what we see now is that it's not enough now to just manage risks. We also need to think about what are the things that could possibly happen, right? That may not seem to be probable, but nonetheless are plausible. So if I want to use an example in this part of the world, I think that a business like Afriland Properties, right, would never have envisaged that they would have the sort of fire that they had, right? So in regular risk management, they probably wouldn't be thinking about that sort of thing. But I mean, it did happen, right? We've seen in other parts of the world, we saw the Heathrow Airport shut down. We saw the national grid collapse in Poland and France, and it affected about 2 other countries as well. So about 4 countries had problems with that. That is something that is not probable, but plausible. And so what scenario planning does is that it allows you to engage with uncertainty in a very proactive way. And boards need to be very, very strong on, I think, with scenario planning, because what it does, it allows you to build coherent stories about uncertainty and engage with it proactively. And it has to be something that boards engage in more, and it gets embedded in their in their strategic planning process. I think the other thing also is culture is a big one. You know the famous quote that culture is strategy for breakfast. It's so true. the culture really needs to underpin being able to handle these shocks that happen. So I think learning organizations make all the big difference. So a culture where there's that focus on learning. If things go wrong and we recover, we shouldn't just walk away. What we need to do is to look back and interrogate the chain of events and see what wisdom we can learn so that we can take it forward into the future. So that learning culture is very important. Also, building cultures where people can speak up, people can recognize where there are gaps and point out gaps without the fear of being victimized. Right. Is very important because it means that you are not blindsided. So building that psychological safety is a big thing that I think needs to happen. And the third thing I want to touch on is also having crisis management structures in place, because this crisis is not something that they're not far off anymore. They're happening all around us all the time. So you must have a crisis management structures in place before the crisis happens. And that goes from things like having your trigger points. So when something goes wrong, at what point do you respond? What's the appetite for being able to handle these shocks? At what point do you respond? Who does what? So all of that, the roles and responsibilities, the decision-making rights and all of that need to be in place and articulated, and everybody knows what they are in advance. And then also you must have your crisis communication in place. I find that sometimes we don't have that crisis communication in place. And so when things happen, we find that the communication is not very coherent, or we find that the conflicting communication messages being put out. So it's important for organizations to have that crisis communication in place, knowing who speaks, who says what, at what point do you respond. If we look back to what happened with the astronomer, what that happened, where the MD and the I think was the chief people officer were caught in an compromising position. You saw the way the way they responded. It took a while for the board to actually kick in, but eventually they did. And in the end, what they actually did was that they then put out a message to draw attention back to the business. They used, I think it was Gwyneth Paltrow. That was really smart. So I think those are some things that need to be put in place, because now we see that uncertainty is the new normal.
Yes, so there's so much to put in place, as you have pointed out. And you've also mentioned the fact that there's wisdom in the crowd, and that calls now to the fore the question of partnerships, collaboration amongst stakeholders from the public sector, private sector, and everyone in between. Where does the role of partnership and collaboration sit in this whole conversation?
Extremely important. There's a saying that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. I think that's much more important now than ever before. So it's not just about the different actors, it's also about those relationships and the interaction that enriches the output. And each actor must realize that everybody has their unique perspective, right? And they bring those perspectives to the table, and that everybody benefits when they work together. So those partnerships and that collaboration is critical. I think regulators particularly need to realize that they really are on the same side as the operators, and that regulators and policymakers can be enablers of business. So if they work together, they're not perceived as being blockers, because sometimes operators or the private sector see the regulator as a blocker. So we need to get rid of that, and we need to have them working together. And I think structures like working groups, for instance, or those sort of platforms where they come together to share perspective, where they start to think about what's happening in the environment, where they think about what measures need to be put in place, what changes need to be put in place. They're very powerful, because people then start to at the end of the day, it's all about relationships, and we're all human beings, right? So if we're able to interact a bit more, we're able to let our guard down, and then we build trust and mutual understanding. And that's very important. And the private sector must engage with the regulator. They shouldn't see the regulator as an enemy, because ultimately they're all on the same side. And if the ecosystem is working better, then everybody benefits. So the private sector must engage with the regulator. Don't only show up when something goes wrong. Build that relationship so that when something does go wrong, the relationship is in place. So engage with the regulators, engage with policymakers, and share ideas across the board. So I think these are some measures. The other thing that we see these days is the regulatory sandboxes. And the regulatory sandboxes allow operators, the private sector, to experiment with new ideas, experiment innovation under the eye of the regulator. So the regulator defines the sandbox, and they work together with the operators to test these ideas before anything gets rolled out. We've seen that happen with CBN. CBN has put in place a regulatory sandbox. I think also the insurance industry has done the same thing. So co-creation of policies and regulations is important. I think gone are the days when everything happened from the regulator down. I think now they need to work together. And I think also, because the private sector, they have lots of experience that the regulator doesn't. So they actually know a lot about what's happening. They have the touch point with the customers, for instance. So I think they can have input into policies and regulation as well. And so when we have them all working together, it benefits everybody.
Indeed, everyone benefits. And finally, there's a lot that you've highlighted that needs to be done, but there are limited resources. And there's also the question of sustainability. That's a huge part of conversations these days amongst corporates. So how do we ensure that these companies are aligning with global best practices, even amidst limited financial resources?
Yes, I mean, I do a lot of work in that space, and it's a question that we get asked over and over again. I mean, some people think, for instance, that the whole issue of sustainability and ESG are foreign concepts, and we shouldn't worry about them here. But the issues we talk about are here with us. So for instance, we talk about climate change. I think you can't listen to the news in Nigeria without listening to stories about communities being disrupted, displaced, farmland are destroyed, and these ultimately affect supply chains, right? So those issues are important. And I think another issue that I like to talk about is the level of inequality that we have in our environment. There's that huge income disparity. But there's a saying that the poor cannot sleep because they're hungry, and the rich cannot sleep because the poor cannot sleep. So as long as we have this level of inequality in our environment, it fuels crime, it fuels corruption, there's social unrest, and all of these things are risk to businesses. So I think what businesses need to do is to think about which of these issues are material to them, and that's what they need to really focus on. So they need to conduct what we call a materiality matrix, where they start to identify what the big issues are for them, what they need to put on the front burner, and what are a lower priority. And that way they can engage and start to put solutions in place, start to put set targets for themselves, and also determine the metrics to enable them measure their progress, and also be able to render account to their stakeholders.
Thank you very much for your time, Ms. Ivana Osagie, the CEO of PWR Advisory.
Thank you.